Hi, I'm Alexa, and today we are going to talk about the Bill of Rights. So, back into this little book that I received on the day that I became a citizen of the US. About a week ago, we did the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution itself, the main bulk of that. We went over Article 1, 2, and 3, it was only a 20-something minute video, so it's not really in-depth, but we went over those. Those set up the legislative, executive, and judicial branches and explain the powers of each and how they run and how elections work and things like that. There are another 4 articles, so I will probably go over those at some point. But tonight I wanted to talk about the Bill of Rights. So, what I have learned or relearned, as the case may be, from rereading this, is that the Bill of Rights was 12 amendments that were sent to the states that ratified the Constitution as the first 12 that would be added through the amendment process that is actually spelled out in the Constitution. 10 of them were approved, and that is what we call the Bill of Rights. So, the First Amendment, many of these people will likely be familiar with, but I'm going to read some of them. I'll read in full, some of them are a little bit longer, but then we'll just break down what that means. So, Amendment 1, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So this one is quite literally guaranteeing that the government, the federal government, cannot infringe upon our religion, our speech, our press, peaceful assembly, and then petitioning the government for redress of grievances is basically holding them accountable and telling them to fix stuff, right? So Amendment 2. Now this one is very interesting because up until the 1950s, it was read the way that I personally read it. And then there was a documented, well-documented campaign to change the reading of this. Now, the thing that I will point out, there's 2 things before I go into the Second Amendment. First, our founding fathers were meticulous in choosing the words that they put in these amendments in the Constitution itself. They were meticulous. When you put something at the beginning of a sentence, you are adding emphasis to that piece. So, the second thing I will say is that today, it doesn't really matter what was intended 250 years ago, because there is, in the Constitution, a way to update or change certain things that we wish to within this whole document. So, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So, we know that this is being read in current day to mean that the government can't regulate anything, weapons, arms. We obviously know that this is not true because private citizens can't, to my knowledge, own tanks or surface-to-air missiles or worse, right? So we obviously know that they can regulate things, but this doesn't say, based on the historical documents and based on everything we know about why this was written the way it was written, this was meant to mean that the states had a way to defend themselves against the federal government should that occur, be necessary. And it came out of the fact that they did have to rise up and overthrow the king and the British rule. So we also know that a well-regulated militia in the States actually evolved and became the National Guard. So the way that this is written and how it should likely be understood today, as they would have meant back then, is that the National Guard cannot be infringed upon by the government. Now, like I said, if you think that that is should be different, That's totally okay. You're entitled to your opinions. Obviously, interpretation of these things is literally, people spend their careers doing this in the judicial system. Obviously, that's what they do. But when you look at all the historical documents and you know that a well-regulated militia was literally what is now the National Guard, and you understand the context of the other writings at the time, this wasn't saying that anyone, not like any citizen, can have stuff. But should they? Should they not? I am not making any observation on what we should have in place today. I am simply saying an observation of what was written at the time, the fact that they were meticulous with their words, and they made it very clear that they can't infringe on the militias, which we know are now the National Guards. That's all I'm saying in terms of that one. All right, Article 3. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. They can't force you to house soldiers in your house. There was a really big grievance with the British forcing colonists to house and take care of soldiers with no compensation. And they were being, we all know there was taxation without representation in the Houses of Parliament, which is similar to the Senate and Congress here. That's the British have the Houses of Parliament. So this was something that was very, very important at the time, that they can't force anyone to house soldiers. So the federal government can't force us to do that. All right, Amendment 4. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So the Fourth Amendment is quite literally saying that the government has to have really good probable cause in order to search your person, your property, that you own yourself, you own your stuff, and they have no rights to go into it without the probable cause. There's definitely gray area, like what is probable cause, and that is why we have so many laws in the judicial code in terms of what is a reasonable probable cause, what is search and seizure, and there's always different opinions on where that sliding scale, where the line is. Sometimes it seems very obvious and sometimes it isn't. And I think that that's true on pretty much all of these. The thing that I will say is that once you give an inch, it's easy to take a mile, right? So we do have some things in terms of like freedom of speech. We know that hate speech is not free speech. We know that things like shouting fire in a packed theater, that could cause massive harm and stampedes and crushes. And so there's things that you can't do. But in general, when someone just has a different opinion than another, no, they can't get into it. Now, this is what the government can and cannot do. Other private citizens are not necessarily held to these things, these laws. Like my right as a private citizen to have a different opinion than you and to tell you my different opinion, and likewise you to say your opinion back, that we both have the right to say what we believe. So I think people sometimes misunderstand what the First Amendment is, especially online. People think that a private business that is not the government has to sit there and take you promoting hate speech. And they don't. They have the right to protect themselves from consequences of your actions, just as you have to live with the consequences of your own actions, which is the irony of being free. We have to live with the consequences of our choices. All right. Amendment 5. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So this one is a really beefy amendment. We have the right to grand jury. They have to indict us, or we would not be able to be held accountable. Like, we couldn't be taken to court without that if a grand jury doesn't think there's enough evidence. No double jeopardy, so they can't try you twice. If you get convicted or not convicted, they can't try you again. Now, I know that there's some rules where if there's compelling evidence that should have been presented this first time, things like that, there's some sort of gray areas, but not. It has to be a very, very good reason why something would be allowed to move forwards a second time. But I think it's more holding the government. So if you were found not guilty and something new comes up, I think that's not allowed. But if you were found guilty and new stuff comes up, then you can ask for the new trial. Don't quote me on that. Not an expert, but that is my general understanding. No self-incrimination. So this is where we get the phrase plead the fifth. You have zero compulsion. You are not compelled ever. They cannot ever force you to say anything that would incriminate yourself. And I think that I often hear people say, like, only a guilty person would plead the fifth. No. If you watch true crime, like I watch true crime, it is something like within 2 hours of being in a room with certain interrogation techniques, they can get innocent people to say incriminating things and confess. It's ridiculous how easily they can get anyone to confess. Now, but this is also why certain interrogation techniques are illegal, and why you get things like confessions thrown out, convictions overturned, when it is proven that they did use certain techniques that are illegal. So pleading the fifth is probably any single one of us best option in any situation, even when we are innocent. Ask for a lawyer, because listen, when you're sitting in a room with a cop like getting in your face, you are going to be in fight or flight mode. You are not going to be thinking completely rationally, and it is your right to have someone there to help you. So that's actually in a future in the next amendment. Let me see. No self-incrimination. Okay, right to due process. So they cannot deny us our due process. So some of the issues with some of the actions that have been going on for decades, let's talk about Guantanamo Bay. Very quickly, Guantanamo Bay is not in the US, because if it was, there would be hell to pay. It is in a location that is not within our jurisdiction, but technically is, because it's a US prison. And because it's in this gray area, this limbo, there are people being detained there who are not being given their due process as outlined in our Constitution. The fact that in the past month, thousands, I believe, of people have been shipped there, and the same issue is being said, it might bring this back into the public realm that there could potentially be American citizens, innocent American citizens, wrapped up in a group of people and taken there without due process. And if it comes out that there is going to be absolute hell to pay through the courts, and our society is going to have to reckon with that. What we need to be aware of as citizens is that if they can do that to one other citizen, it is no longer a right. Okay? So while it may sound really good, or someone will say something that sounds very reasonable, be very careful of not letting those lines get blurred, because if a single American citizen, and technically they don't say a citizen, they say anyone, so that does include immigrants. They do not say a citizen is due this right, and they very clearly state when it is a citizen right versus a right for everyone. If someone can get caught up in this that shouldn't be, then anyone could be caught up in this, and they can do that to any of us. So I think I said this in the last video, and I keep going back to this because it really is just a really succinct way of saying it. There's an Eminem song, and he says, teaching a new generation of kids to stand and fight for the right to say something you might not like. We have to be open to the fact that if I want free speech, I have to make sure I fight for the right for everyone's free speech, and then use my free speech to tell someone else I think that their speech is terrible, right? Like, that's where free speech is. All right. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without compensation. So this is the basis for eminent domain, I want to say. And eminent domain is when the government can basically dictate that certain, or designate that certain land is needed for a public use or public good of some way. And I might be getting this slightly wrong, but this is my understanding of it. When they do that, they cannot just seize the land. They still have to compensate the homeowners for it. Now, I think that that's a really kind of shady way of doing this, because they never actually seem to pay what is a person could actually get. They don't pay a market value or slightly above, if it's a tight land market. I don't know. But that is where no property being taken without just compensation, eminent domain, and the laws around that and things like that end up coming into play and being judicial coded out. All right, Amendment 6. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. So the Sixth Amendment is your right to a speedy trial by a jury of your peers, meaning people who live in where the crime occurred. You have the right to be confronted by witnesses, but also to confront your witness. This right is one that I do struggle with when it comes to trials where a child is there being the witness who is accusing, especially a parent, but any adult. And that child has to be re-traumatized in the courtroom or you can't prosecute it. I think that that's very disgraceful. I think that there are other ways of doing it. And I know that I've seen trials where the child was in another room with a video thing, so they didn't have the intimidation of the parent staring at them. But I've also seen trials where I think it was a 10, 12-year-old boy. His dad was acting as his own lawyer and freaking cross-examined him. And that poor kid, those are the kind of gray areas that are very easy to be tricked into giving up rights that we keep and hold evident and need for ourselves, because it sounds so rational and so common sense, and like you want to protect a child. And that one, I don't think there's any benefit to re-traumatizing a child when maybe there's physical evidence that's been documented, right? I don't know. I have issues with children being forced to sit in a court and face their abusers. Amendment 7. Did I get everything on number 6? Oh, assistance of counsel. So we all have a right to have assistance of counsel. I said that in a previous one. It would be in a future one. Now, the question currently playing out from what I've read in some news articles, it might not be really current, but like within the past maybe year, is does that guarantee that we're given that right without having to pay for it, right? So a lot of people, even when they are found innocent, if they were provided a lawyer through the state, they are then slapped with a bill for that service. And this amendment, Amendment 6, says neither they'll have to pay for it or they don't have to pay for it, right? So that's a very murky area that I'm sure people who are Sixth Amendment scholars would know way more about than me. Amendment 7. In suits at common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. So this one, I did have to look up to make sure I was reading this one right. I have a link to the National Archives that has the Bill of Rights, and it'll kind of help explain some of it. So I will put that down below as well. So Amendment 7 protects the right to a jury trial in civil cases, and then what the jury decides, a judge cannot overturn that. So even if the judge disagreed with what the jury found, the jury's opinion or verdict stands. Amendment 8. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So this one's pretty self-explanatory. No cruel and unusual punishments, no excessive bail, and no excessive fines. Now, what is excessive is obviously open to interpretation. I feel like I might have mentioned this in the previous video, or maybe I was just thinking it out loud. I try and sometimes talk through these things before I film them. A person who is a millionaire, right? A $5 million bail might be a fraction of what they actually have. Whereas for me, there's no way I would even ever come up with that. No one would ever put that bail up for me, right? Like, I don't have assets that much. So for me, it would be cruel and unusual. But for someone where that is like a fraction of their wealth, it's not necessarily excessive. And that is, I think there are, if I'm remembering correctly, I believe there are sort of sliding scales, or like, not a sliding scale, but kind of like a chart that says, helps judges figure out what the right amounts should be. I'm sure each state kind of has different stuff as well, but cruel and unusual punishment. This is also a conversation. Is solitary cruel and unusual? There are times when people are put in solitary, quite literally, because if they weren't, the other inmates would be after them. But we as people, we don't do well in solitary confinement. It is psychological torture for us in general. There may be exceptions to every rule. There may be some people who would absolutely love it. But in general, it is psychological torture. It's tantamount to torture. So there's really a balance of we're doing it to protect your life versus, but then there are people who put people in solitary and they shouldn't be. So that's only one example. The right to a speedy trial, if we go back to the Guantanamo Bay and the right to counsel, there's a whole bunch of stuff that is not being upheld there. If I remember correctly, someone who was captured in like 2002, 2003, right in that initial stretch of time after the September 11th attacks, they, at least a couple, like maybe 2-3 years ago, were still there. And they've still not had a trial. That is insane that person has not had a trial yet. Like, how is that possible? How have we as citizens not held our government accountable to do what this document that we have all agreed is the supreme law of our land? How have we not stood up for those people? And now might say, oh, well, they're really bad people. Okay, if they're really bad people, then the government has evidence, and that trial jury will find them guilty, and then they can be put legally into wherever it is they need to put them. it makes you question if the government actually has evidence that they are not moving forward with trials. At least it does me. Now, I don't know. I do not know. It just makes you question, right? All right, so Amendment 8, super short. We said that one. Amendment 9, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So the Founding Fathers were very, very clear that what is listed in this document and in the first 10 amendments, although they had proposed 12 at the time, they knew that not everything that we have an inherent right to was listed. And this amendment is basically saying, like, all because it isn't listed in here doesn't mean it's not a right, right? Like, it is still a right if it's a right, even if it's not listed in this document. It's a very complicated way of explaining what I feel is a pretty straightforward amendment. And then the last one, we are getting there. Ooh, this one did get a bit long, 26 minutes already. Amendment 10, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So this is saying that quite clearly, this document is delineating what the federal government can take, what states are not allowed to do, and then anything else not included is the states' rights. Then, as with everything, the gray area becomes, is something actually covered by, for example, the Fourth Amendment of our right to ourselves, right? Of our right to our persons and our property, no unlawful searches and sieges, no infringement on that ownership of ourselves. And that's a very interesting one. I've probably studied more on the first, second, fourth, and fifth than the other 6 in the Bill of Rights. The fourth is one that is very interesting. It can be applied in multiple ways. Our right to bodily autonomy, that is our ownership of ourselves, is the right to bodily autonomy. So what is covered by that right to bodily autonomy? Where is the line? And definitely food for thought. All right, y'all, if you made it this far, I hope that I was clear in reading them, and then that my summary of them, which I did again check against the National Archives, I will put that link, and other resources. I checked it against other resources, but you can certainly Google for interpretations of the various amendments. It's just a summary. This is not a be-all, end-all. Like I said, there are scholars out there who literally have spent their whole lives studying and arguing and reading the supporting documentation of the time, what the founders actually intended, what they stated these amendments were for, how they have been interpreted differently over time and applied to current day problems that were not even conceived of 250 years ago. For example, technology. We literally did not have technology that we have today even 50 years ago. Like, we had some computers, but nothing to the extent that we have today with the internet and the knowledge sharing and information that's out there and free speech areas, and what is the government controlling versus not controlling. How do they regulate businesses that then regulate free speech? Is that an infringement on free speech? There's so many layers to our society now that our founders would never have, even in their wildest dreams, begun to be able to imagine. But they laid out, with the knowledge that they would not be able to do that, they laid out the process for doing amendments. So there are 27 total amendments. We just went over the first 10. I will do at least one more video on the remaining 17. I might split it up depending on how, once I get into realizing and writing my notes out on them, how beefy that would be. I don't want it to be an hour-long video. This might actually top out as one of my longest videos on this channel. So if you did make it this far, let me know your thoughts. I'm not trying to start arguments. I'm trying to present a very balanced view of what was specifically written, not how we interpret it necessarily, although I tried to also say how we might interpret it in some instances here, just as examples, but also to know that there is a process that if we don't like the amendments, we can propose new ones and change this. That is our right as citizens, to be able to hold our elected officials accountable, to have them pursue changes to the Constitution, to our laws within the without changing the Constitution, with the laws and the interpretation of them. That's our rights as citizens as well. So knowing what our rights are is the first step in being able to defend them, and to be able to recognize when people are saying really, really reasonable sounding things that are smoke and mirrors, where the actual intended consequence is that our rights are taken from us. And it also allows us to engage more fully in discourse of the gray areas, because maybe it's not taking a right. Maybe it really is finding where the line is for certain things, like what is a cruel and unusual punishment. It might be different in different situations. So think about it. And know that this is not me trying to tell you exactly what to think. I don't have all the answers. I find it fascinating to think about this. My views and my knowledge have evolved over time. And that is where, genuinely, that's where I'm coming from with this, is to hopefully give people who have never actually studied this at least a little bit of a starting point and an introduction to it, so that from here you can actually go out, go on Google, Yahoo, search, whatever one you use, and look up scholarly articles, use the resources, go to the National Archives. And yeah, thank you for being here if you made it this far. Be kind to yourself.